remember to open your microphones, please.
Oh, yes. We are very honored to have Dr. Anne Fogarty as guest speaker at the symposium. Anne Fogarty is professor of James Joyce Studies at University College Dublin. She was president of the International Joyce Foundation and has been co-director of the Dublin James Joyce Summer School since 1997. She was associate director of the Yeats International Summer School and was editor of the Irish University Review. With Luca Crispi, she is founder and co-editor of the Dublin James Joyce Journal. She has co-edited 3 collections of essays on joy and has written widely on 20th century and contemporary Irish writing, especially on women authors. A collection of essays, Deirdre Maiden, New Critical Perspectives, co-edited with Marisol Morales Ladrón, was published by Manchester University Press in June 2022. She recorded a podcast on Ulysses for On the Road with Penguin Classics series. She is editor of the Contemporary Irish Writer series for Bucknell University Press. Recent publications include an essay on memoir and biography for UCD Press's 2022 reissue of C.P. Curran's James Joyce Remembered, and an essay on Joyce and Dublin in 100 Years of Ulysses, edited by Con Tobin for Penn State University.
Thank you. I will just... Is this working?
It is.
Okay, good. Okay. Hello to everybody. Greetings from Dublin. And hello especially to everyone in Irish Studies, colleagues, friends and students in Buenos Aires. And I'm very, very sorry I can't be with you in person. In keeping with the conference theme, this paper considers a few aspects of Scylla and Charybdis, which is the 9th episode of Ulysses, which brings the Irish literary revival and Shakespeare together. And I'm just using Yeats here as one of the effigies of the revival. In Scylla and Charybdis, the revival and Shakespeare seem to be 2 opposing things. As you may know, in Homer, Odysseus and his men have to somehow wind their way between 2 opposing dangers, rocks and a whirlpool. And one could presuppose that English culture and Irish culture, the revival and Shakespeare, are some of the twin dangers facing the Irish in this episode. But it's more complex than this. As some of you will know who've read Ulysses, Joyce convenes a very idiosyncratic dramatist personae in this episode, many of the main, but also many of the lesser figures in the Irish revival. Amongst them, Buck Mulligan, Oliver St. John Fogarty, John Eglinton, A.E. George Russell. Many more, however, are absent. Padraig Colum, Douglas Hyde, James Starkey, Oscar Wilde, Bernard Shaw. And particularly the prime figures of the revival are not there. Yeats is missing, Lady Gregory, and J.M. Synge. And I will get back to Synge a little bit later in what I have to say. In some ways, Joyce is mischievously decentering them. Synge, of course, is dead by this point anyway, so he could not have been in the library. But Joyce is coming up with an odd picture of the literary revival and revenging himself in part on the gatekeepers of this movement who partly kept him out, kept him at bay. But at the same time, he is showing us how entangled Irish and English culture are. They are not just polarities and dichotomies. At one point, and this is where the quotation in my title came from, George Russell, who's a kind of spokesperson within the episode for the revival overall, says, "Our national epic has yet to be written," Dr. Sigerson says. So Russell here is quoting George Sigerson, an Irish writer, but in fact he's quoting something that Sigerson never said. So again, Joyce is messing things up. He's forcing us to pay attention to aspects of the revival that are problematic, and intertwining this revival with a favorite author of his, Shakespeare. At the beginning of Ulysses, in the Telemachus episode, Buck Mulligan gives a very absurd account in advance of Stephen's theory of Shakespeare, which is what we encounter in the library scene in Scylla and Charybdis. Stephen wends his way towards the library to meet up with various friends and people who are interested in him to expatiate on his Shakespeare theory. And Mulligan says he proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. So he's deliberately turning Stephen's theory in advance into a kind of absurdist drama. At the same time, Haynes in the same episode alludes to Hamlet in a different way again. And of course, we're in a tower, so we're in the location of Hamlet. Haynes says, explained to Stephen as they followed, "This tower and these cliffs remind me somehow of Elsinore." And that is the where Hamlet happens, where the tower is situated in Denmark. "That beetles o'er his base into the sea, isn't it?" Now, Haynes's glossing of the tower as Elsinore in Shakespeare's Hamlet is very flat-footed, but it is also quite ominous, as it's a reminder of the fact that these men are all three living in a decommissioned military fortification, which in fact Buck Mulligan, Oliver Synge and Fogarty is renting from the British state. So they're on alien territory and living in a building which concretizes British rule in Ireland and acts as one of the early symbols of colonialism in the text. We find that Stephen Dedalus, in his theory of Hamlet in Scylla and Charybdis, makes Shakespeare into a kind of colleague or confederate and insinuates Shakespeare's language into his work and Shakespeare's plots. But he also contrarily underscores Shakespeare's problematic Englishness, as Haynes is beginning to do anyway, and Haynes is supposedly an Englishman in Telemachus. Just one line from Scylla and Charybdis: "Khaki Hamlets don't hesitate to shoot." So moving on next to thinking about Joyce's attitude towards Shakespeare overall, and the way in which he reflects on Shakespeare at different moments in his life. Throughout his career, Joyce's comments on Shakespeare are at once adulatory, positive, and inherently divided. So Joyce is divided, ambivalent about the revival, but likewise he's divided about Shakespeare too. He sets Shakespeare up simultaneously as opponent and as confederate. He veers between being entirely dismissive of his influence, positing him as other and a rival, and seeing him as a fellow artist and unassailable touchstone. And this comes true in this quotation from Stanislaus Joyce's diary about his brother, titled "My Brother's Keeper." His attitude to Shakespeare was vitiated by his cult of Ibsen, yet he seemed to know by heart many passages and most of the songs of Shakespeare's plays. He had attacked Macbeth vigorously for its formal deficiencies in an essay to which Thomas Arnold had assigned a high classification. So here Stanislaus is drawing out these divided attitudes. Joyce prefers Ibsen to Shakespeare, yet he knows his Shakespeare so much that he has learned whole passages and songs by heart. And yet, on the other hand, he's written an essay as a university student attacking Macbeth. In another passage from My Brother's Keeper again, Shakespeare is very interestingly placed. And these are ideas that I'm going to work with in thinking about Joyce's account, both of the literary revival and of Shakespeare in Scylla and Charybdis. Here it's striking that Shakespeare is associated with male rivalry between opposing male authors who have a claim to cultural capital. Stanislaus remembers a day on which Shakespeare was important. Joyce wanders the streets of Dublin with his friend and enemy, Oliver Synge and Fogarty, and they competitively quote Shakespeare at each other. It so happened that I was with them one day when they, Oliver Synge and Fogarty and Joyce, were quoting one against another songs from Shakespeare's plays. My brother was reciting Autolycus's song, and this is a song from A Winter's Tale. My brother defended his right to appreciation of the song with arguments based on sympathetic understanding. So here Buck Mulligan and Joyce, Stephen Dedalus, ostentatiously and aggressively quote Shakespeare at length at each other. So in a way, Shakespeare is insinuated into this competitive relationship between these two men. Fogarty disparages Joyce's performance in a bit of this passage that I omitted, but Joyce insists on his privileged insight, his sympathetic understanding into this beautiful song from Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. Another anecdote again from Joyce's student days, this is from his days in University College, Dublin, is about an oral exam that Joyce undertook in which he's cross-examined about Shakespeare, in this case, the play King Lear. And he's asked by his professors, how is poetic justice exemplified in the play of King Lear? Joyce replied very briefly, I don't know. His examiners are taken aback and ask him to elaborate. They know that he has studied Shakespeare in great depth. But Joyce refuses the question. Oh yes, replied Joyce, but I don't understand your question. The phrase poetic justice is unmeaning jargon as far as I am concerned. Here, Shakespeare is refuted on aesthetic and ethical grounds. The issue is no longer mastery or knowledge, but the frameworks within which the playwright is read and interpreted. And once again, there's a kind of element of male rivalry. Who has authority over Shakespeare here? Is Joyce's view of him correct, or that of his professors and examiners? Shakespeare was a canonical author and part of the school and university curricula in Ireland at the start of the 20th century. But as the quintessential English author, he also occupied an anomalous position in Irish culture. To this day, as far as I know, there's no statue to Shakespeare in Ireland, unlike in many other countries outside of the UK itself. Stephen Dedalus's theories of Shakespeare in Ulysses in the 9th episode, and particularly in Scylla and Charybdis, are grounded in wide-ranging academic research. And they also take up debates about Shakespeare that were raging in Ireland. And I'm just going to instance one small facet of these debates. Pulling out two representative figures, a priest, Joseph Darlington, a Jesuit priest, whom we know as the Dean of Studies in Portrait of the Artist as a young man, who wrote about Shakespeare and taught Shakespeare to Joyce when he attended UCD. And then Edward Dowden, who was Professor of English Literature, in fact, had the first chair of English Literature in Trinity College, Dublin, and was one of the most authoritative Shakespeare scholars in the era. He was known for his very famous book, Shakespeare, A Critical Study of His Mind and Art. So Joyce attends the Catholic University, which is quite recently founded. And Darlington, in fact, propounds a Catholic view of Shakespeare, but he means Catholic here in the widest sense. Shakespeare's Catholic mind was completely unsectarian, Darlington argues in his article, in fact, a two-part article called The Catholicity of Shakespeare. By contrast, Dowden in Trinity College argues for a Protestant, much more imperial Shakespeare. He says Shakespeare was for all time, but he also belonged especially to a Protestant age, a monarchical age, an age that was eminently positive and practical. At another point in his book, Dowden says, it must be admitted that Shakespeare had within him some of the elements of English conservatism. Now, Dowden's portrait of Shakespeare is multifaceted, but he does insist on foregrounding this Shakespeare who dovetails with some aspects of English imperialism and who acts as a kind of quintessence of Englishness. At the same time, we must bear in mind that Dowden enters some notes of skepticism into his study. He says at the very end, let us not attenuate Shakespeare to a theory. And in fact, Stephen Dedalus in Scylla and Charybdis is actually imitating Dowden when he begins to dispute at the end of the episode his own theory. People put him on the spot and ask him, does he believe in his own ideas? And he says no, a kind of backhand gesture towards Dowden. So let's move closer to the episode itself, and I'll make a few points here. It becomes clear that Shakespeare is revered in Irish culture. He's a totemic figure, canonical, that there is bardolatry, as we call it, in Ireland as well as in England, but that also he's a problematic measure of what the Irish want to achieve. In a well-known set of lines from the episode, Eglinton, who was one of the chief critics in the era and who valued Joyce's writing, intones, our young Irish bards, John Eglinton censured, have yet to create a figure which the world will set beside Saxon Shakespeare's Hamlet. So Eglinton is drawing out here how the Irish revival is a breakaway movement from English literature, an attempt by the Irish to retrieve Irish values, Celtic aspects of Ireland, early Irish folklore, and so on, to create an independent and distinct literature of their own. But yet at the same time, the measure that he's proposing is Shakespeare and Hamlet. And as we know, Stephen puts forward a highly elaborate and dramatic and startling account of Shakespeare and Hamlet in Scylla and Charybdis. So he plays with Eglinton's contention. He looks both at Shakespeare and Hamlet and re-theorizes them. What are we then to make of Stephen's perplexing theory of Hamlet? It spawned many divergent readings and has variously been seen as meta-commentary, an exercise in failure, a pastiche, literary criticism as a kind of mini-drama, and even criticism as a kind of anticlimax. The other revivalists on the scene stress the links between Shakespeare's life and art. They want a Shakespeare who builds his plays out of a depth of reflection upon life. Stephen conceives of it differently, drawing on a profusion of theories about Shakespeare in his own period, many of which were biographical. So he's drawing on people like Georg Brandes, Dowden, Sidney Lee's A Life of Shakespeare. Stephen concocts a different kind of life of Shakespeare. And this is a life of Shakespeare that is rooted in the everyday, but also somehow converges with Ulysses. So I'll read the next passage. He's imagining Shakespeare going to the globe on the bank of the Thames. It is this hour of a day in mid-June, Stephen said. The flag is up on the playhouse by the bankside. Stephen has left the Huguenot's house in Silver Street and walks by the Swan Mews along the river bank. The play begins. A player comes on under the shadow. It is the ghost, the king, a king and no king, and the player is Shakespeare, who has studied Hamlet all the years of his life. What's striking and startling about Stephen's description here is that Shakespeare's day is a June day too. He's converging 16th of June, 1904, with a 16th of June, 1604, in which Shakespeare walks forth from Silver Street, and Shakespeare was indeed living on Silver Street at that period, and goes to perform in Hamlet. Hamlet would have been performed sooner, but could possibly, conceivably, still have been in the repertoire. So Stephen's rejigging of Shakespearean biography to conflate it with the day on which the novel Ulysses takes place is plausible. And Shakespeare purportedly did play the ghost of Hamlet in the play. Thus, the diurnal, that is the everyday world of Shakespeare, shades into and is juxtaposed with that of Stephen Dedalus and Bloom in Dublin in 1904. Stephen roots Hamlet inextricably in the material realities of Shakespeare's life, just as he gives us the material realities of all of his characters in Ulysses. By borrowing methods from the critics of his own era, who in various ways worked with a biographical fallacy, he insists on a kind of conflation of life and work. He asks, is it possible that that player, Shakespeare, a ghost by absence, is it possible or probable that he did not draw or foresee the logical conclusion of these premises? You are the dispossessed son, I am the murdered father, your mother is the guilty queen, and Shakespeare born Hathaway. So another startling contention has been put forward here. And again, what Joyce is doing is conflating his work with the work of Shakespeare. There is a conjoined project at foot. Startlingly and provocatively, Gertrude, that is the queen in Hamlet, Anne Hathaway, and Molly Bloom, who is another guilty wife, are cross-connected in this fictional invention here. There is unanimity in the biographers and critics that Joyce would have been perusing in relation to misogynist interpretations of Anne Hathaway. Anne Hathaway is very routinely seen in very sexist terms, and on very slight grounds. The fact that she was 8 years older than Shakespeare and pregnant when Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway got married has given rise to countless needling and sexist dismissals of her. Joyce embroiders on these insinuations via Stephen Dedalus's theory and concocts a new and even more graphic plot of betrayal and sexual jealousy that he at once reads and inserts into Hamlet and adduces as determining his later plays. His rereading of this tragedy borrows in part from the plot of Ulysses, which is also about a treacherous wife who is maybe condoned but also attacked in the course of the novel. And so he embellishes on the story of Hathaway here, and equally thinks through the plot of Ulysses in more lurid terms. But ultimately, I think in Scylla and Charybdis, Stephen Dedalus puts forward a manifold account of Shakespeare. He gives us this biographical story of Shakespeare, rooted in material realities, eaten up with sexual jealousy. A further embellishment on this biographical plot that he invents is that Anne Hathaway slept with his brothers, thereby providing Shakespeare with the plots of his later plays, but also presenting us with a Shakespeare who is eaten up by sexual jealousy. But Ulysses, as I'm suggesting, undoes all of these neat suppositions as well. So we have the high drama of Stephen Dedalus's Shakespeare theory, but there are other moments and accents within Shakespeare's, Stephen's account of Shakespeare as well. We have a Shakespeare who lives an everyday life, goes forth to Bankside. He drew Shylock out of his own long pocket, the son of a malt jobber and moneylender. The Lost Armada is his jeer in Love's Labour's Lost. His pageants, the histories, sail full-bellied on a tide of mafficking enthusiasm. Here he gives us a kind of imperialist Shakespeare, akin to Dowden, but cross-associates Shakespeare with one of the battles in the Boer War. Mafficking is one of the great sieges in the Boer War. And so Shakespeare is being read forward in time and linked with British colonialism in the present moment. However, we have another Shakespeare as well in this very beautiful passage that many of you may know. This is a Shakespeare who is idealized, is a godlike author, is much more transcendent. This doesn't seem to be the biographical everyday Shakespeare, the imperialist Shakespeare anymore. And here Stephen uses a line from Hamlet to begin with, and then beautifully thinks about it and spins it further in this passage to think about Shakespeare, and particularly the Shakespeare at the end of his days, who stopped writing and returned to Stratford, left London and the stage behind. Man delights him not, nor woman neither, Stephen said. He returns after a life of absence to that spot of earth where he was born. His journey of life ended. He plants his mulberry tree in the earth. So this is Shakespeare in Stratford, then dies. And what though murdered and betrayed, bewept by all frail, tender hearts, for Dane or Dubliner, sorrow for the dead is the only husband from whom they refuse to be divorced. He found in the world without as actual what was in his world within as possible. Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting myself. It's a very beautiful lyrical passage, and it gives us a multitudinous account of Shakespeare, a Shakespeare that contains everything, indeed a kind of godlike Shakespeare. But I've highlighted one phrase which almost slips past one when one reads it. You don't quite notice what Stephen is doing. He thinks about Shakespeare still in Hamlet terms. This man who has been betrayed by a wife, a treacherous wife who's played him false. So calls him Dane. Hamlet is Danish. Dane or Dubliner? The Shakespeare here has transmogrified into a Dubliner, an Irishman. So through the alchemy of Joyce's and Stephen Dedalus's theory, Joyce's language and Stephen Dedalus's theory, in the phrase Dane or Dubliner, Shakespeare is simultaneously conceived of as fictional and real, English and Irish, a Danish malcontent and a Joycean character. To the transformative force of his malleable vision, with its plurality of ghostly analogues, Joyce here confirms honorary Irish citizenship on Shakespeare and makes him a native of Elsinore, Stratford, and Dublin. I'll move next to the final points that I want to make. The way in which Joyce in Scylla and Charybdis makes use of Shakespeare to think further about aspects of the Irish literary revival, to use Shakespeare in order to think about the aesthetic that fuels the revival, the differing artistic views that were being propounded by different revivalists, and particularly to think about Joyce's rivalry with the central Irish playwright in the period, John Millington Synge. Synge is absent from the episode, but much invoked. He is dead, so he's being invoked as a kind of double absence. His plays with those of Yeats and Gregory, as you will well know, were key aspects of the new Irish repertoire staged by the Irish Literary Theatre. Joyce was fascinated by Synge, whose works he knew closely, but he also quarrelled with him on aesthetic and other grounds. And one of the many reasons for Joyce's fractious relationship with this vital predecessor, whom he also imitated, was the fact that, in effect, there was no room for a further playwright on the Dublin scene because of the startling originality of Synge's work. So in some ways, Synge is both an enabling and a disabling presence for Joyce. Markedly, Joyce uses Shakespeare to mediate and reflect on his rivalry with Synge, restyling as he does the competitive relations of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre. At one point, Buck Mulligan purports to confuse Shakespeare and Synge. Buck Mulligan thought Synge's name has just been dropped into the conversation. Buck Mulligan thought puzzled. Shakespeare, he said, I seem to know the name. A flying sunny smile rayed in his loose features. To be sure, he said, remembering brightly, the chap that writes like Synge. Here, Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan and Joyce are echoing a comment made by Yeats about Synge, but it's noticeable that the revival and Shakespeare are brought together here. Synge is positive as a kind of Irish Shakespeare, but indeed, of course, Joyce is inserting himself into this position too. There are further proleptic moments in the exchange between Buck Mulligan and Stephen Dedalus about Synge. It's Buck Mulligan who imitates the language of Synge. So Shakespeare's language seeps into the narration of Scylla and Charybdis all throughout from the very beginning of the episode, but so too does the language of Synge. Sing song, as it's sometimes referred to, creep in to the discourse here. This is Buck Mulligan imitating the language of a playboy of the Western world. "'Twas murmur we did for a gallus potion would rouse a friar, I'm thinking, and he limp with leching, and we 1 hour and 2 hours and 3 hours in Connery's, sitting civil, waiting for pints apiece." Stephen lapped. Quickly, warningly, Buck Mulligan bent down. "The tramper Synge is looking for you," he said, "to murder you. He heard you pissed on his hall door in Glastool. He's out in Pampooties to murder you." "Me?" Stephen cried. "That was your contribution to literature." Now, all kinds of things are being cross-connected here and confused and reconfigured in a kind of dramatic showdown. Mulligan uses Synge's language to complain about Stephen standing them up in a pub called Connery's, where he was supposed to meet them. And then he produces this portrait of Synge as someone seeking vengeance. Synge here becomes the Hamlet figure, the tramper Synge. And also Synge seems to become almost a character for his own play. Pampooties were the boots that the Iron Islanders read. The anecdote is, I think, apocryphal. It's refuted by Stephen anyway. Synge never lived in Glastool anyway. And Stephen didn't piss on his door. So he says that this is Buck Mulligan's commentary on the literary revival, not Stephen's own. Moving to that word gallus that's used by Buck Mulligan. "'Twas murmur we did for a gallus portion." Here Joyce is being mischievous and using these altercations with Buck Mulligan and the other figures on the scene in the library to upstage Synge in a way and to re-dramatize Synge. Gallus is a word that crops up in a Playboy of the Western world. It's Hiberno-English, Irish English, but it's quite rare. And to most students of literature and students of the Irish Revival, we particularly associate it with this play. And it's used at a climactic moment in Playboy of the Western World, when Pegging Mike says, emotionally enunciating her disappointment with the Playboy, there's a great difference between a gallus story and a dirty deed. Gallus can mean exaggerated, horrid, mischievous, excellent. And here, Pegging Mike is taking the Playboy to task for actually attacking his father. She accepts the fantastical story of someone who kills their father when it's seemingly a story, but when it takes on a tinge of reality, she sees it as a horrifying story. The Playboy of the Western World was first staged in Dublin in January 1907, and we're reading about an episode that takes place sometime in the day, mid-afternoon, 16th of June 1904. So Joyce here is preempting Synge, in a way staging his play in advance in Scylla and Charybdis, in the way that he restages Shakespeare too. And in another moment where he thinks about an encounter between himself and Synge in Paris, he also notably uses Shakespeare to think about the problematic aspects of this encounter. Harsh gargoyle face that warred against me over our mess of hash of lights in Rue Saint-André des Arts. This is a street in Paris. In words of words for words, palabras. Oisin with Patrick, fawn man he met in Clamart Woods, brandishing a wine bottle. Saint Vendredi Sant, murdering Irish. His image wandering he met, I mine. I met a fool in the forest. This latter phrase, I met a fool in the forest, stems from As You Like It. There are two fools in As You Like It, Jaques and Touchstone. And this line, I met a fool in the forest, is Jaques' excited speech about seeing Touchstone in the forest of Arden. It's being applied here to Stephen's encounter with this Gothic figure of Synge in Clamart Woods, which is a forest, small forest near Paris. So partly it's being intimated that Stephen plays Jaques to Synge's Touchstone. Jaques is the much more saturnine, darker, intellectual fool in As You Like It, and Touchstone is the much more harmonious, playful one. Yet a contrary reading and a crossover of roles are also feasible, as the harsh gargoyle face of Synge has some of the melancholic traits of Jaques too. So partly, to summarize my point, Stephen Dedalus is suggesting that Synge and Stephen are opposites, Oisin and Patrick. Oisin is a pagan folkloric figure, and Patrick the bringer of Christianity. Partly they're the opposing fools in Shakespeare's As You Like It, but partly their roles cross over, so maybe they are akin. So I'll draw to a close. Towards the end of Scylla and Charybdis, we have a further restatement of this very elaborate effect that Stephen Dedalus sets in motion and Joyce does overall within the artistic devices of Scylla and Charybdis, whereby Shakespeare is absorbed into Joyce's plots and language and restaged, upstaged, reconfigured. At the end of the episode, Buck Mulligan says playfully, we went over to their playbox, Haynes and I, the Plumbers Hall. Our players are creating a new art for Europe, like the Greeks are Meister, Maeterlinck, Abbey Theatre. And again, it's a proleptic moment, like the staging of the Playboy earlier on in the episode. The Abbey Theatre is set up later, but here proleptically, what happens is that Mulligan pre-announces its emergence later that same year in December 1904. And I'll move towards an end. There's a quotation from Shakespeare at the end of Scylla and Charybdis. Not surprisingly, of course, it stems from Cymbeline, and this is already evident when you read the lines. So the lines that I'm giving you here are the final lines of Scylla and Charybdis, and also the final lines of Cymbeline, a Shakespeare play. Cease to strive, peace of the Druid priests of Cymbeline, hierophantic, from wide earth of altar, laud we the gods, and let the crooked smokes climb to their nostrils from our blessed altars. So Joyce, once again, is conflating his voice and the intertextuality of the episode with Shakespeare, but it is a pointed moment. Usually it's seen simply as a moment of reconciliation, but Cymbeline is partly a Celtic play, and it has problematic colonial politics. Much of the action of Cymbeline takes place in Wales, where the characters take refuge. And very oddly, at the end of the play, the rebellious Cymbeline, who's a British king and has been at war with the Romans, despite being victorious, so he's victorious over the Romans, actually surrenders and pays tribute to the Romans. And hence those lines, laud we the gods. He's going to create a sacrifice to the Romans, indicating now a peaceable moment. The phrase crooked smokes has already echoed in the narrative of Aeolus. In Scylla and Charybdis, Stephen frequently cross-connects himself with the heroine of Cymbeline, a woman called Imogen, and particularly the image of the mole on her breast, which is used at once to identify and betray her in Shakespeare's play. This final quotation in Scylla and Charybdis may be seen to exemplify the crookedness of Joyce's text and its complex take on Shakespeare. Cymbeline, for much of the 20th century, was one of the least performed of Shakespeare's plays, but it seems to have been particularly resonant for modernist writers. It echoes, for instance, to Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, who quotes from the dirge over Imogen at various points in the text. Joyce appears to share this newfound enthusiasm for Cymbeline in the period, but he conspicuously stresses the Celtic setting in which peace is seemingly sealed between Britain and Rome. This emphasis alerts us to deliberate accents that Joyce is putting in place. So he's using Cymbeline indirectly here to make an argument about the colonial conditions of Ireland and the way in which Shakespeare depicts colonial and imperial relations. As the critic Willie Maley has argued, Cymbeline as a play is an anomaly, as it is a Welsh play in which, in fact, no Welsh characters feature. And the Celtic setting, while of central symbolical import in Shakespeare's play, especially Milford Haven and the harbour, which is often mentioned and was bound up with the Tudor myth, seems actually to be denuded of the Welsh or of any Celts. The final scene of Cymbeline is notoriously chaotic and involves over 24 revelations. As post-colonial and political commentators now recognize, this ending, far from offering a resolution, is inherently ambiguous and ironic. Cymbeline capitulates from a position of power. So this British king puzzlingly succumbs to the Romans after all. But in doing so, it's implied that British renewal will come from the Celtic fringe. Thus, opposing and warring implications are conjured up in the closing moments of Cymbeline, which may conflictingly be read as self-immolation, an international peace pact, an assertion of Celtic superiority. It's Cymbeline who offers the branch of peace to the Romans. Or a flagging of hybrid identity, whereby British identity, Roman and Anglo-Welsh identity all come together. Moreover, Joyce's cross-linking of Stephen and Bloom with Imogen, which he constantly does at moments, both in Scylla and Charybdis and other points in Ulysses, draws attention to the problematic action of this play. And another facet of the ending of Scylla and Charybdis that one tends to slide over, like that phrase, Dane or Dubliner, that I drew your attention to earlier, is the insinuation of this phrase into the quotation from Cymbeline, Peace of the Druid Priests of Cymbeline. In mentioning Druid priests in the final lines of Scylla and Charybdis, Joyce actually is insinuating new characters into Shakespeare's plays. He's inserting these Druid priests into Cymbeline. There are none present. If you have a look at an edition of Cymbeline, you'll discover this. Thus, he turns his version of Cymbeline here at the end of Scylla and Charybdis into a play with Welsh and also implicitly Irish presences, because Druid priests could cover both the Welsh characters who are missing in this instance, but also Irish characters begin to populate this Shakespeare play. Even though his rivalry with Shakespeare is played out in part in Scylla and Charybdis, Joyce alerts us to, at many points throughout the episode, to his shared project with Shakespeare, whereby both of them set out to invent open-ended and transnational theatrical worlds in which the particularities of a myriad number of characters and voices can be captured and given voice to. In Scylla and Charybdis and Ulysses overall, Joyce recruits Shakespeare for the Irish literary revival. Shakespeare, in effect, becomes a revivalist by default, and for his revolutionary aesthetic with its pluralist and democratic values. Joyce breaks down false oppositions between national literatures, but also enjoys as modernist writer, performer, and dramaturge in repurposing and restyling Shakespeare's texts and incorporating them into his Irish epic. He incorporates Shakespeare into the Irish revival and in effect uses Shakespeare as well to adjudicate on the differences and also the ambitions of the revival. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fogarty, for sharing an original point of view on Ulysses through William Shakespeare. I wonder if people would like to ask you questions. Yes? Well,
just a comment. I'm Laura. Thank you, Jane, and for your enlightening lecture. I think it is really, I admire a lot your work, because we have, despite we have read Ulysses and so on, we haven't seen so many, how do you say, cross linkings as you have done today. And I think that this is marvelous to see how rich Joyce's work is, in a way, because when we read Ulysses as a whole, you know all this wide world view that he has and he brings to the reader. But when you start pointing out at these different linkings that he is doing is amazing. So I really thank you a lot for this. And then, of course, even with Synge, Shakespeare's Synge you brought to this, and all this rivalry. And is there any other writer at the time that he is in a way competing in bringing out
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
Is it?
He's competing with all of them. Yeats, of course, as well. Famously, when Joyce met Yeats, he told him that he was too old already to be changed by Joyce. And at the same time, he knew Yeats's stories by heart, the tables of the law and so on, and quotes Yeats also throughout Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. He feels a rivalry, I think, with all of the figures of the revival, but that the rivalry doesn't detract from an admiration as well. So I think he's trying to think through these this competitive rivalry for him is positive in a way. It's sparking off something new. Of course, it has its dark aspects. Stephen Dedalus in Scylla and Charybdis also is alerting us to the fact that he feels shut out from the literary revival. But he's thinking his way back into the movement through his thoughts about all of the revival figures and about Shakespeare as well. And you're right, of course, it's because Shakespeare is the wider author. You know, Shakespeare's already, long since been seen as this global world author. Admittedly, narrowing him down to just an Englishman is the problematic aspect of it. So the episode allows Joyce to think through all of those problems, England versus Ireland, where Irish literature positions itself, given that most of Irish literature is written in the English language. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
I would like to, mine is not a question, but I would like to ask you to expand your comments on one of the quotations you selected, the one in which Shakespeare is defined as that chap that writes like Synge.
Yeah. Apparently, the phrase that what Joyce, what Buck Mulligan and Joyce and Stephen Dedalus are all doing there is Yeats apparently said about Synge, the man who writes like Aeschylus, the Greek playwright. So Joyce is echoing Yeats, but then turning things on their head again. And of course, to conflate Synge and Shakespeare, even if Synge is revered in the period and known to be this groundbreaking, path-breaking playwright, is to push things too far, perhaps, and is a kind of challenge to English and Irish readers alike. So there's a kind of debunking of the Synge's prestige and a debunking of Shakespeare at the same time, and Yeats in the background. So Joyce succeeds in hitting lots of different targets there. But of course, you could take it the other way around, that maybe Synge is a kind of Irish Shakespeare, and then things are a bit different. And Joyce certainly wanted to be the Irish Shakespeare. So that's Joyce's ambition too.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yes, just a comment.
Yeah.
Just a comment, may I? No, just yes. First of all, thank you so much for your dissertation, illuminating dissertation. But I wanted to tell you that, that discussion in the library is so, let's say, so famous in our literature, Argentinian literature, because one of our novelists, Ricardo Piglia, who died 2 years ago, let's say, introduced it in one of the passages of his novel, Respiración Artificial. So, and again, there are references to other works in another novel, but that scene you referred to is present in Argentinian literature, let's say. So it's quite famous, let's say.
Yes, and thank you for that. I wasn't aware of the link, and it's fascinating because it shows that Joyce's kind of restructuring of things and use of intertextuality then transmits itself to the novelist that you are mentioning, and that he plays with the themes further. It makes perfect sense. So thank you for that.
Any other question? Well, again, thank you for an excellent lecture,
Thank you.
Dr. Fogarty.
Thank you.